everybody, and welcome to the Afghanistan Project podcast. I am your host, Beth Bailey, and I'm so excited today to bring on Danilo Zak, who is the Director of Policy at Church World Service. In this role, Danilo leads the CWS Policy Team on strategic engagement with policymakers to advance pro-refugee, pro-immigrant policies and neutralize harmful proposals. Danilo is responsible for managing and executing a strategic plan to advance a refugee resettlement, asylum, and immigration framework that strengthens U.S. leadership and has a positive impact on people's lives. So good to have you here, Danilo. I've heard great things about your work, and I'm so excited to talk about probably some hard things, but maybe some good things too.
Well, it's great to be on, honored to be on the pod. And thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation. I think we actually had a conversation probably a year or two ago for an article about something. So I know you've been in this space for a long, long time, and looking forward to the conversation.
That's like my head is exploding right now because I think that's absolutely true. And sometimes it's like, things just happen and you're like, in the zone, and that is 100% true because yep, I know exactly when that was. Okay, well, how exciting for everybody who's watching as my brain slowly clicks into motion. I should let everybody know I've had an entire pot of coffee today, so we're just rolling and it's going to be so fantastic. But I think to like level set here, this has been a question as people talk about refugees and immigrants and things of that nature. There's two camps. There are the people who think that refugees add richness to our country, and then there are the people who think that refugees take resources from our country. And so, Danilo, how do you respond to that conundrum? A real hard question to start with. I'm just throwing it at you.
No. I mean, it's a question, of course, we get all the time, and it's a really easy one to answer, and you can answer it from a lot of different ways and perspectives. And I think we've been trying to answer that question for years at the Church World Service. And I think there's a lot of different ways to approach it. So first of all, I'd say when people get to know refugees and they welcome refugees into their communities, you don't need all the stats that I'm about to bring up to understand, the value that these folks bring. And that's borne out in the polls. Like people who personally know a refugee are vastly more likely to support the refugee program than those who don't. And that's because when you run into a refugee in your community, they're often a small business owner, or there's someone who is, growing a family. A lot of times refugees are arriving in places not where there's, competition for housing, but in low cost of living areas that are actually in some kind of demographic deficit. And so it's really, really important for them to bring this life and vitality and culture to some of these places around the country. And again, that's borne out in public opinion polls, but it's also, of course, borne out in economic data. And I think the when we talk about enrichment, the fact that I like to share first is that under the first Trump administration, they commissioned a study, the Department of Health and Human Services, in order to try to demonstrate that refugees were a drain. And so they went through this whole process with the hopes that they would do an economic analysis of refugee and asylee entrants and determine that they were a drain on the economy. And they found a massive multi-billion surplus. And so they hid the study, and it was reported, it was leaked, and you can go, Google it. The Trump administration, conducted this whole study and then tried to hide it in the first term because it showed such a positive impact. And that's across the, at the national level, but also state and local tax surpluses as well, just because people are coming and really quickly getting to work. That's what the U.S. refugee program is known for. And they're contributing to their communities. Then in the Biden administration, they decided, let's redo that study. Well, and they used the exact same mechanism, the exact same research process. And that one is out there. And I just think it shows across a 15-year period, an $124 billion surplus. And that's accounting for the cost. So when people talk about it's costly to provide this basic reception assistance in the first couple of months that refugees receive after they arrive, I mean, it really pales in comparison. And in fact, that's a needed investment to allow these folks to land on their feet and grow in their new communities. And they have the safety and stability often when they're coming through the refugee program, as opposed to some other humanitarian pathways where they should have that real safety, stability, work authorization right away, which is really important, not needing to worry about their status. And they're incredible contributors to their communities. And again, you don't have to ask me, you can ask anybody who knows a refugee. It's overwhelming, the proportion of people who support the program when they're around refugee resettlement.
That brings up a really important point. You talk about programs that don't give you that status and that benefit immediately. And, we know that SIV and USRAP do that. Humanitarian parole does not. And that, for people who have gotten humanitarian parole, the very tiny number that have gotten it post August 2021, yeah, they've had to get on their own feet, whatever. But tell me about what that means for the people who came here. And that's the only way we could give them safety immediately on entry, and how that impacted their, I think a lot of people feel that Afghans who came here very early, that they were this drain on the system and they couldn't, talk to me about that and how HP played into that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And, now humanitarian parole has become like a dirty word in some parts. And at the time, back in 2021, people really didn't know what it was, even in the immigration space. I remember, we were working on like an explainer. What is humanitarian parole? Like, how does it work? And now it's become this big political thing where, there's a whole side of the aisle that wants to do away with humanitarian parole. What's interesting is, for historians of the Refugee Resettlement Program, we've really only had a modern refugee program since 1980. And before that, most refugees arrived under parole. And organizations like Church World Service, where I work, and other resettlement agencies were founded not in 1980 when the Refugee Act passed, but after World War II in the 1945 and 1950. And a lot of refugees were coming under parole and then were sort of adjusting to more permanent status. And so parole does have actually a very long history, but the challenge with parole is it's not a permanent status, to your point. It provided just a couple years of temporary protections from deportation. It needed to be re-upped, and it's not guaranteed that it would be re-upped. And the idea was, at the time, that the refugee program did not have the capacity in terms of overseas processing or domestic resettlement, really, to welcome the number of people that needed to be welcomed. And this was, frankly, a failure of the Biden administration. I mean, we had been urging them to grow capacity, been urging them to evacuate folks, as so many had in the months and years leading up to the evacuation. But they didn't, and they didn't have a refugee program that was capable. And so they had to then rely on this more emergency process of parole, which brought people here. I mean, in terms of whether this was a drain or an enrichment, it's the case that people who are under parole get slightly less of that investment in their well-being. But most Afghans got a pretty significant amount of support from resettlement agencies and community members. It was challenging, and there were a lot of people who were being welcomed at once, but they received a lot of that support, and they had work authorization right away, which again is critical. And they were able to begin to build new lives here. And there's so many Afghans who came here under parole who have become incredibly important parts of their new communities. Now, that's much harder when your family members are still overseas and you can't welcome them and you're worried about them, when you're worried about your status, when you're worried about when your work authorization is going to expire, when you're unsure of if you show up to work or show up to school, whether you're going to be picked up and deported. And that's the problem we're having now, which is that unlike refugee status, which itself is under some pressure incredibly, and I think that's something we can talk about, but there's just not that promise of permanent safety and stability that comes with parole that makes it much more challenging for people to really get their feet down and begin building their new lives in their new communities.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think it's a good time to fast forward to January of 2020 and talk about all the things that have changed in the last year, because already my brain is spinning with things that, if you've seen the way that things have gone and you're looking at, oh, we're going to reopen these cases. Are you going to use the same justifications that you use to take away TPS, for instance? And Afghanistan is a perfectly safe place to send people. There's a lot of mixed messaging that has come out in the last 12 months. So I think we need to go back to January of 2025 and let's talk about what were the first things that impacted Afghans. And it might I don't know. You tell me what you think. It might be best to just focus on refugees inside the US at this moment, because it is, I mean, we could talk for hours if we tried to go past that. So
Yeah.
what
No,
happened? Yeah.
I think that's right. And obviously, the very first thing that happened for us that people know about is the refugee ban went into place. And so, to your point, people who are ready to come and who are, had flights booked. These are people who've been through the years-long refugee vetting process. It wasn't part of the rapid evacuation. It was years of people waiting overseas and going through in-person interviews and biometric biographic screenings and medical screenings. And we're finally at this point. I mean, there's like 7, we can talk about, there's like 8 stages to the refugee process before someone resettles. And these people were through all the stages. They had their flights booked to the U.S. They had their families who were waiting for them. We had a case of a Afghan father who had arrived during the evacuation, but had been separated from his 3 young children and had spent years trying to reunite with them. This is where it ties into the people who were here. And their flight, the kids' flight, they're like 7, 13 years old, was finally scheduled for the Wednesday after the inauguration. And when the refugee ban went into place, if you actually read the ban, the text of the ban, it said, we're not going to go, this won't go into place right away. It'll go into place in a week. Because they knew from back during the first Trump administration, when they put in a refugee ban, it was chaos at the airports. And so they didn't want the ban to happen right away. And so we thought at the time, we've got 7 days, let's get the most vulnerable people in. And so we scheduled flights of unaccompanied refugee minors to reunite with their families in the U.S. And on that first week, I remember it was a Wednesday morning, I think. The inauguration, I think, was on a Monday. It was a Wednesday morning. We thought we had 4 days, and they just instituted the travel ban that Wednesday, 4 days early. Those kids were stranded. And it took them months and litigation that we can talk about to finally be reunited with their parents. Many other unaccompanied refugee minors remain separated. So I know you asked about the refugees who are here, but I think part of the story is people who had family reunification cases that they were waiting on that have not come through. And that makes things so much more challenging for someone who's here and is now left in this position where they're not sure when or if their family members, who again had often, in many cases, had flights booked, they were through the whole process, when they'll be able to travel. Now, the almost the less talked about aspect of that first couple months was, in addition to the policy change, there was also this funding freeze that went into place, and we've talked about it overseas, but it also had an enormous impact on resettlement agencies, on service providers who were here. And so Church World Service, among many others, was owed a lot of money from the government, not for future work, but for work that had already been done. I mean, this is money that had already been spent.
Yeah.
And, the administration just froze everything. And so as a result, there was a massive amount of layoffs, closures, and that persisted. I mean, I think Church World Service lost almost half its staff as a result of that. And many others had to shut down sites and offices. And, that's sad for us. But the real tragedy is that in the months leading up to the inauguration, a lot of refugees arrived. A lot of Afghans arrived, a lot of folks from the Congo, from all over the world, who had finally been able to access this rebuilding refugee program, which had sort of finally succeeded in being rebuilt in those last, year or so of the Biden administration. So a lot of people had arrived, but they were only here recently. And I think what we saw at the time was it was kind of the perfect storm of a lot of people who had just arrived, meaning they were in a special need of services, vulnerable refugees who we were trying to get in under this weak deadline that was all of a sudden the doors slammed shut. And then a total blanket funding freeze that meant there was no resources whatsoever to support people. And a lot of people just went without the services that they desperately needed. And there was challenges with accessing housing, and it was challenging with accessing food support. We had sites doing things they'd never had to do before in terms of reaching out to their communities and trying to find some way of coming together and supporting people who had, again, just resettled. And so that was kind of the total chaos of the first couple months, was figuring out what's going on. Travel from abroad had stopped, but how can we support the people who are here in this moment in which there's basically no funding even for the things that the government had sort of contracted us to do.
Yeah. Yep. I remember those days so vividly, and how it felt like the rug had just been pulled out. And, I think the hardest thing is that so many advocates had real hope that the Trump admin was going to change things, because for anybody who's keeping score at home and feels that this is like a bash Trump time, it's not. As you've said, the Biden administration made a lot of mistakes in the beginning. Part of the reason that those refugees were stuck in Pakistan for such a long time is that there was no prioritization of U.S. rep processing, which was supposed to take 12 to 18 months, and do the math. There were years that these people were waiting, and reunification was not a priority for anyone for some time. And now, is it ever going to happen? I can't imagine how it would feel to be an Afghan knowing that your wife is stuck in the Taliban's Afghanistan right now, or your children and your wife, your daughters, your sons going to a madrasa, there's just the badness here is quite bad. So,
oh yeah, and yeah, to your point, these people have been failed by multiple administrations,
yes.
and in fact, for some time, and we're fast forwarding a little bit, but in part as a result of the ongoing litigation, but really over the last year until November, it was mostly Afghans who we were serving in terms of new arrivals, because the SIV program had resumed. Our contracts ultimately were restored. Again, that was part of the litigation that Churchill Service and others have filed in Pacito versus Trump. But we did see some refugees begin to arrive, and we saw Afghan SIVs arrive. And not only did they arrive, but they were eligible for the same services that had previously been eligible for, because the administration continued to contract with resettlement agencies like CWS. And so we were actually optimistic, if I could even use that term, heading into 2026, that, maybe we could see a lot more SIVs arrive because there were more visa windows available. We knew there was a massive need with so many people who were still stuck overseas and at risk. And there was some, minor signs from the Trump administration that they were willing to sort of move forward with some processing. They renewed the contract with IOM to help with flights of Afghans to come to the U.S.
Yeah.
We were thrilled about all these things, and we were looking forward to not only resettling Afrikaners, which again we can talk about too, which is the current reality, but there was some signs that maybe we'd be able to rebuild some of the processing and continue to welcome folks in towards the end of the year, although largely not through the refugee program, which had been mostly shuttered since January 23rd.
I think you bring up Pacito v. Trump, and I had forgotten that CWS was signed on to Pacito v. Trump. Amazing efforts on, you guys in IRAP's behalf there. And there were the moments. I would love to hear about the cases that you got through, because as far as I had known, there was only one case that was able to get through with the Pacito v. Trump exception, and it was an incredible woman who had been a prosecutor and her husband who had been a journalist. And the only reason he was able to get through, you must know the story, right? I remember telling someone at IRAP about it. They're like, wait, what is happening? I was like, yeah, these people are arriving tomorrow. And they're like, what? But because the husband had been arrested in Pakistan, and to get his release, the U.S. government, prior to the suspension, had given him a document that he was able to show to get onto a plane. And then they used Pacito v. Trump to say, you can't kick us out when they landed. And these people were incredible. And I wish I could say all the things I know about them, because I think that all of the people who are concerned about refugees would hear it and go, wow, that's amazing. But I'm not going to, because I think there are some aspects of their story that they want to remain private for many reasons. But tell me about the other families, Danilo, that were able, you said the children were able to get through eventually with the Pacito v. Trump exam. I know that there are other people. So can you say, like, how many people were able? Because every one of those is a story, is a human life, is a world, That's amazing.
Yeah, I think, and we're kind of in an interesting position now, right? Because we filed this lawsuit in the beginning of last year. Mm-hmm. And there were times when it really looked like, and we got these great rulings from the district court as well, and it really looked like we were going to compel the administration to truly resume resettlement in larger numbers. And at one point, it looked like the population of refugees who had been conditionally approved by USCIS, again, these are people who had been through years of vetting, would all at some point be able to come. And we still fight for that. That's still what we're fighting for. Mm-hmm. But the Ninth Circuit held that up. And so now we're in this posture of it feeling like, where were the wins? But if we look back, there were some tremendous wins as a result that continue, actually, as a result of that litigation. So the family you mentioned, but there were, probably around 60 or 70 refugees who were able to arrive. Children who were reunited. Pacito himself reunited with his family and resettled to the U.S. in North Carolina in the summer of last year. And Pacito's case was one of these emblematic cases where he had left his job. He had his flight booked. He was leaving in mere days when the ban went into place. He had left his job. He had sold his belongings. He didn't have his documentation to stay in the country that he was in because he was traveling to resettle to the U.S. when the ban went into place. I mean, it was just one of these particularly egregious examples that is demonstrative of so many different cases. And so there were some people who were, especially those who were scheduled to travel in just the days after the ban went into place, who were ultimately resettled during the time in which some of the preliminary injunctions were in place and before the Ninth Circuit ruled. So it wasn't a huge number of people, but to your point, every one of those people is a story that deserves to be told. And, that lawsuit's worth it if one person was able to be resettled. And I'll say another victory from the lawsuit that people don't totally recognize is when SIVs arrive, and there's some even arriving now who had visas in hand before this expanded travel ban went into place, they're still able to access support and services. And part of the reason for that is the Pacito litigation. And the Ninth Circuit has so far not compelled the administration to continue resettlement, but it has compelled the administration to continue services to people who have been resettled. And that's really important. That covers SIVs and thousands of SIVs who have arrived. And so I think it's important to celebrate those victories. I look at that litigation and I'm really proud that Churchwood Service was involved in it. I'm proud to be alongside IRAP and the Resettlement Agency in Seattle and the refugee plaintiffs who are a part of that, the courageous refugee plaintiffs who are part of that lawsuit. And I think we've won a lot of real victories there. And that litigation isn't over. I mean, right now we're in the discovery phase at the district court level. We're still waiting on a ruling from the Ninth Circuit. And in my opinion, they should be watching very closely what's going on with the refugee program that is currently at a record low ceiling and resettling only white South Africans. So, in that case is very much still alive, and we're following it very closely. There's some other litigation that we're also following, and IRAP are champions. I think there was a ruling today, actually, in the SIV processing that maybe we could get to. But
oh my gosh, I didn't know about that. Yeah, we're gonna have to talk about that. Oh, so let's fast forward then, because that's awesome. And I didn't realize that Pacito was still alive. For some reason, I thought that had kind of crashed and burned. So that gives me hope, which I really need right now, I feel like, and so does everyone. So, I know the podcast has already covered a lot, TPS going away. I think if we can just really quickly talk about like the dominoes that fell leading up, because it's so funny. I've had Andrew Sullivan talk about the hope when, IOM took over the flights and
Yeah,
no one left behind didn't have to anymore. The hope that preceded November. But for me, right before that horrible, horrible shooting, the release of the leaked intention to revet
yeah,
all refugees for me was like, oh no, this is bad. That was
yeah,
my feeling at the time. And so anyway, let's do the dominoes that fell. So we had
sure.
TPS goes away. What
Yep.
else in the next months happened that kind of destabilized the situation for Afghans further?
Yeah. So to your point, we have TPS going away. We've got, of course, some ongoing uncertainty for people who are on parole, with the understanding at a certain point that, at least in this Congress, something like the Afghan Adjustment Act is going to be very difficult to achieve. And then, right, to your point, in November 21st, I think it was reported on the 24th, but the memo is dated the 21st. We have this new plan from USCIS. Again, this was not sparked by any particular action or moment. This was just something that the administration was planning to do all along,
Yeah.
and came out before the shooting in DC and before this suite of other policy changes that we'll get to. But this memo called for the review and re-interview of all refugees, essentially, who arrived under the Biden administration. So any refugee who was resettled between January 20th of 2021 and February 20th of 2025. So that covers, again, all the refugees who arrived under the Biden administration, excuse me, which is, I think it was over 230,000 refugees in total, who are implicated by this review. And in addition to that, that memo did something else. And this is where it actually will be helpful to understand some of the future policies. A lot of them have kind of come in these two steps. One step is this planned review or re-interview, which we weren't sure exactly how it would play out or who would be impacted, or who within USCIS would be conducting the reviews. These are total black box. We had no idea what was going on. And then another aspect, which happened right away, and that was halting all green card processing for refugees, right? And so that went into effect on November 21st. And we knew at that point that the administration was interested in not just individuals who are on temporary protected status, not just individuals who are on parole or other kinds of limbo statuses, as we call them, that were kind of explicitly not permanent and had an end date that was coming up soon and seemed like were going to be targets for the administration. Now, they were also going to go after folks who were brought here through the Refugee Resettlement Program, folks who had received asylum. And this memo was the beginning of that, and we're continuing to see this administration target those who, to my mind, have been promised permanence and stability by receiving refugee status, and had in some ways earned that by waiting for years and going through so much processing and in-person interviews and security bar checks and biographic and biometric data collection. And refugee resettlement has long been known as the gold standard for vetting across any entrant to the U.S. And these people had all gone through that, of course, to come to the U.S. So that happens on November 21st. We don't really know when or how the review and re-interview will take place at that point. What we do know is that green card processing has been paused. So for a refugee, you arrive, you have a year where you're on refugee status, and then you're sort of automatically considered for a green card after the year. And then after 5 years on a green card, you can become a citizen. So it's this path to permanence that so many others are looking for. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't come right away. And there's a lot of folks who are still in that first year who haven't yet adjusted to a green card, and they're more vulnerable. And so the administration is both saying we're thinking about terminating refugee status, and we're going to stop people from adjusting to that green card that gives them a little bit more stability. So then we have the shooting. I think it's, November 26th maybe, or 27th.
Yeah, 26th.
And following that, as I'm sure you've covered in this space, a just spate of additional policy changes that have gone into place, impacting so many folks. We saw, in particular, the halt of all asylum adjudications, affirmative asylum adjudications. We saw, again, I think it's helpful to think of these as like the halts that went into place right away, and then sort of the reviews and re-interviews that are more amorphous. We don't know when they're coming or who will be targeted, and some have already happened, and some might be coming later. So in terms of the halts, we had a halt in affirmative asylum adjudications. We had a halt in all kinds of immigration benefit applications for Afghans and for others on this expanded travel ban list. So that includes work authorization applications. That includes green card applications. That includes naturalization ceremonies. After you've gone through the whole citizenship process and you're in line, you're at your citizenship ceremony, there are people being plucked out of line who are waiting to become citizens. So I think it's important to understand that pause is sweeping when it comes to people's access to benefits here, and is going to result in people falling out of work authorization. In fact, already has, and is going to result in people losing access to benefits that they have lawful right to. And then when we're talking about the halts, we're also talking about visa halts. So that's when the SIVs halted, a little bit later on in December. That's when other kinds of immigration visas were halted. I mean, Afghanistan was part of the initial travel ban, but SIVs were exempted, and so were direct family visas, immigration visas for family members. Those have now been all halted as well. So there's a blanket pause, shuttering basically any legal pathway to the US for an Afghan, and shuttering any pathway for people who are here to not just adjust their status, not just change what they're on, but even maintain basic benefits like work authorization, which they should remain eligible for depending on the status that they have. So that pause was sweeping and deadly. And then in addition to that, it's kind of this expanded threatened review and re-interview. And what does that mean exactly? We're still not entirely sure. But beyond just reviewing refugee cases, the administration also rolled out a series of policies designed to, or at least noting that they intend to review other benefits that Afghans and others have already received. So again, if someone's adjusted to a green card, that adjustment might be under review. If someone's received asylum, that reception of asylum might be under review. And this is where, at the time, now we're in like mid-December, heading towards the holidays, a lot of these memos sort of said, we'll share more details about the operationalizing these reviews in 90 days. And so we said, okay, they clearly bit off more than they can chew. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. They can't review everybody. So somehow they're going to try to target certain populations here. And we still haven't gotten real information or data about who they're going to target with these reviews and re-interviews or when. What we did see, and now we're fast forwarding a little bit more, and then I will pause because we can dive into any of those aspects or continue moving forward. But what we did see in early January is, rather than guidance on how the reviews would go into place, we saw refugees just begin to get detained in Minnesota. And ICE was going door to door. They were going after refugees who had resettled in the past year. They were going after refugees who had not yet adjusted to their green card. So again, remember, you stop letting people adjust to green cards, and then you start going after those who haven't adjusted yet. And they were arresting them. They were detaining them. They were shackling them. They were sending them to Texas, and they were interrogating them, essentially, to try to find some evidence that under the Biden administration, the vetting wasn't up to snuff. Some evidence that the interview that should have happened under the Biden administration didn't go according to plan. Trying to find some derogatory information. This was not a considered, we've found derogatory information, let's pick somebody up. This was detain first, ask questions later. And it was called Operation Paris, which stands for Post-Arrival Review Re-Verification. I forget the exact, here I have it. Post-Admission Re-Verification and Integrity Strengthening Paris was this initial operation. And so over 100 refugees were arrested and detained in Minnesota as a result of this, including children. There was a 4-year-old who was sent to Texas. There are some horrific stories, which I can share some of because some are in the public record, of people who were caught up in this operation. And that's the beginning. To our understanding, that's the pilot, right? There's so many others who are potentially at risk with the sweeping nature of the proposed review and re-interview. Again, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, given it's on across almost all statuses, and a huge number of nationalities. And so they started with this pilot in Minnesota targeting resettled refugees, and we're preparing for what might come next.
So I want to go backwards because there was one thing I remember the New York Times dropped that might be beyond what you are following at CWS because it was a legal action. It was, I think there were Afghans who had, I don't remember if it was detainers or something, but basically it was like, hey, these are people who need to be arrested, but they hadn't been. There was no, and it basically ICE put out a memo saying, go grab these people. Do you know if that ever happened?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So what I missed is in that rundown of sort of the policy changes is there has been kind of a steady ramp up of enforcement as well. Mm-hmm. And we know that there was a policy, to your point, right around this time, kind of following the shooting in November 26th, when there was this spate of policies directed towards Afghans and others, that included an effort to really go after Afghans who had, final orders of removal. Now, my understanding from folks on the ground is that they didn't just pick up those with final order of removal. There were a lot of Afghans who were detained in a variety of different statuses. As a result, there were a number of Afghans who were detained in Sacramento, some in Virginia. Again, these are places where a lot of Afghans have arrived, of course. Now, I don't know all the details of that operation and have followed it a little bit less closely. But my understanding from talking to some folks in Sacramento was that it really was a little bit unclear, and there was so much fear in the community, and continues to be, of course, because it wasn't totally clear whether they were just going after people with final orders of removal or they were detaining others as well, and why. Mm-hmm. And that's, of course, been a feature and very well reported of the administration's approach to immigration, which has been somewhat indiscriminate, to put it lightly.
Sure. To me, it's kind of interesting. I feel like everyone was prepared for deportations of Afghans and things like that to happen. And I still don't think that has occurred, which is, one maybe silver lining in all of this is that people were prepared for it to immediately go to a very bad place. And it hasn't gone there, but every story I've heard about an Afghan getting detained under circumstances that were inherently unfair and made no sense, it's debilitating. It's destabilizing for all the people who relied on that person to not be in jail for no particular reason.
And to your point, I think early in the year, in the last year, when the administration started revoking some other individuals' parole, right? There was the termination of parole for people who arrived through the Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuela parole program. There was a termination of parole for people who entered at the border through the CBP-1 app, including some Afghans. Yep. But there was not, and we had heard rumors, in fact, I think it was reported, that there were intentions of also terminating parole for Ukrainians who arrived through Uniting for Ukraine, and for Afghans who arrived through, the Operation Allies Welcome. And we didn't see those from happening. We've seen some individuals get detained, to your point, but we haven't seen this mass termination happen as we have for some of these other parole categories. And part of that is a demonstration, I think, of, the limits of the administration's willingness to target populations where people across the political aisle and across the country have huge support for. Churchill service, we served a number of Cubans and Haitians who were impacted by those policies. I think the prospect of returning people to Venezuela right now is wild. The prospect of returning people to Haiti right now at the end of the transitional government is completely absurd to me. But we ultimately didn't see, to your point, I think, the termination, detention, deportation of large numbers of Afghans. Although, that might be coming. And I think something we did see is some other refugees get deported to places where they very much, feared persecution. We saw some Bhutanese refugees get deported to Bhutan over the last year. So we have seen the administration be willing to deport people to areas where, in my opinion, they face unbelievable danger and persecution, and in many cases had demonstrated fear of persecution on the basis of one of the 5 protected grounds in order to make it to the U.S. So that doesn't mean that we won't see deportations in the future. But to your point, that's been fairly limited at this point.
It's interesting as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about Campus Silesia almost being like a test case for what can be gotten away with in terms of Afghans, as they still have not told CAS residents to which third country they will be sending them.
Right.
And continue to offer money if they'll just go back to Afghanistan, where there will be a welfare check, maybe. It's like...
Right. I mean, which is it's totally in keeping with the approach, right? And for the refugees who were sent to Bhutan, they were not able to stay in Bhutan. They were immediately sent away, and now they're back in a refugee camp in Nepal for the most part. So this is what happens when you try to return people to places where they've fled persecution. It's not happy days, get a welfare check and go about your life. I mean, these are people who had demonstrated claims of persecution. I mean, in many cases, we evacuated, right? So I think that there's definitely a need for some clarity with respect to the people at CAS, and it's important to understand this is a very harmful prospect to deport a refugee back to where they were persecuted.
Yep. And I think that it's, perhaps there's just not as much attention to the issues that those in Bhutan were facing and the numbers of people. But I know with Afghans, it's a very small group, but they're very vocal. And, like what happened when TPS got brought up, but people went wild because how dare you say that Afghanistan is a safe place to send people back to? I think they would have loved to do that. And I think they realize that's not going to be a popular decision if we do that.
Yeah. And I mean, listen, we do a lot of advocacy at Church with Service. We're mobilizing faith communities. We're mobilizing, service providers. And of course, we're part of the Evacuate Our Allies Coalition, which No One Left Behind is as well, and many, many others. And it's these people holding the line. It's every day. It's, to your point, it's not a huge group, but there are many people who are vocal when some of these policies go into place, and it's so important to remain vocal as we continue into this year.
And it's across the aisle. It's people of all backgrounds, all faiths, and that's the important thing here is it's what I've loved about being part of this effort for the last 4.5 years is it transcends all of the things that send us into our political corners and make us falsely despise one another. This is a coalescing effort. And
Absolutely.
But I think that it's under threat at this particular moment is a feeling I have not voiced out loud outside of several conversations with people one-on-one, but I do feel like it is under threat of breaking apart because of the stress that the entire system is under right now, and that would be detrimental. Think about it.
I totally agree. And it's interesting. I know you talked to Andy about the hearing, I guess it must have been a couple of weeks ago, and this issue has had so much bipartisan support for so long. I mean, I remember when we were, again, just learning what humanitarian parole was, and we were trying to explain to members of Congress. And it was mostly Republicans who were there, eager to better understand what was going on. And of course, the Afghan Adjustment Act has had leading Republicans in support of it for a long, long time and continues to um, in its new name, Afghan Protection Act. And I think in that hearing also, that hearing was scheduled in the days after the shooting when emotions were really high in November. And,
Yeah.
it was ended up happening in January. And I think that for the most part, the media cycle has moved on. I think for the most part, if you listen even to the Republican members, they still understand the value of some of these programs. Emotions are not nearly as high as they were in November. There's an understanding that we shouldn't be scapegoating the actions of one individual or scapegoating so many due to the actions of one individual. And, the problem is we're in a totally different policy environment. And that's the point that I want to make is, the media has moved on, but the policies have not. The policies changed, and they're still changed, and that is enormously difficult and challenging for so many Afghans who are here, who again are now blocked from accessing any kind of benefit, have employment authorization documents that might be set to expire, have family members overseas, SIVs who are overseas, who aren't able to come, and so I think in some ways that it felt like that bipartisan huge coalition was under threat. I don't feel like it is anymore, but the policies have still changed, and now we're fighting from even more. It's even more of an uphill battle now because we need to claw back, some of the dramatic policies that were implemented in the days and weeks after November 26th.
Sure. Yeah. I wonder, I think for the last segment of this, I would just like to hear, what is CWS doing to mitigate all these things, or to create hope in a population that I know right now is, I mean, I can't imagine being an Afghan and feeling that, you're not really wanted here. You're not, and I know that there are many people who are alleviating that feeling, right? And working really hard to do that. But what is CWS doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, we're doing what we can, and the first thing I would say is you're right. A lot of people are feeling like they're not welcomed in the way that they thought they would be, and so I think the most important thing we could do is continue to stand by the allies who arrived, continue to stand by the Afghans who arrived, and others who arrived, and were promised protection, and were promised stability, and have begun to build new lives in their communities. And so we're standing by them in the ways that we can. And that includes being vocal when we need to be, and issuing public statements and galvanizing our network in support of policies that are protective of Afghans, but also just being vocal that they're welcome here and we want them to be here. And then, that's the national, our public statements and our actions. And we're also doing quite a bit on the ground still. Like I said, across CWS sites, you'll probably find more Afghans than any others who are continuing to be served. Partly because the SIV program had still been in place. And again, the litigation with Pacito v. Trump allowed some of these basic reception and placement services to go forward. And so we're continuing to, do what we can to give people case management and make sure they have access to legal assistance when they need access to legal assistance, which almost everyone does now, and make sure that they have access to basic support, housing support, access to services in their communities, connecting them to their communities. I mean, that's what we've been doing for 80 years, and it's especially important now. I mean, I think we recognize that the people who we serve, often in the U.S. resettlement system, it's the trope is 3 months and you get to work and we're done supporting you, and it's true in many ways. We get people to work fast in the U.S. resettlement system. It's one of the good things about the system. Other countries might say you could give them an extra little while and help them upskill and help them learn languages. So we can that's a conversation for another day. But the U.S. resettlement program gets people to work quickly. But at CWS, it's not just about that. It's not just about the first 3 months, especially now. It's about making sure people that we've brought into our communities are, have a path to safety and stability, regardless of the policy environment. And so we're trying to find ways to provide legal services to people. We're trying to find ways to connect people to those in their communities who can be supportive. We're trying to find ways to support the litigation that's ongoing. There's litigation blocking this Operation Paris I mentioned, targeting refugees. There's litigation. I think IRAP has also filed a suit. IRAP, amazing. You'll never find a bigger fan of IRAP than me, but I think they just filed a suit compelling COM approvals to restart, which is amazing. So I think we're trying to uplift that, and we're doing what we can when it comes to working with members of Congress too. I mean, one of the big challenges right now is the SIV program hasn't been reauthorized, and it needs to be. And so that's something that Congress can do. And as I mentioned, I mean, I think if you listen to that hearing, there's a lot of vitriol, but there's a lot of support for the SIV program. And I think something we really need to continue pushing forward is getting that bipartisan support, seeing that become law, and continuing to build towards a program, or maybe multiple programs, that once again welcome those who are fleeing from violence that they're at risk for because of their support for the U.S. And so that's something that CWS is working on too. But so it's grassroots, connecting people and networking people at the local level. Our sites are continuing to provide direct services and legal services. And then at the national level, we're trying to raise hay. I mean, we're trying to make sure people are still listening and still care about this issue. And we find that they do. There's so much going on. There's so much happening, but all it takes is raising your voice, and we try to make sure people are able to do that and talk to their elected leaders about raising their voices too, because there's a lot of support still in Congress. Just sometimes it's not as vocal as it could be.
No, it's gotten a lot quieter since January of 2025, and I am saddened to see it. And it's really important to have people be vocal in Afghans' corners again. Because I know that they just don't want to say it. And, I want to say one thing too, because the New York Times did an article on the SIV program last week, and it raised a lot of concerns in the Afghan community and in other communities that the SIV program was just dead in the water entirely because Congress hadn't authorized additional SIVs. And that is completely untrue. Do you want to speak to that, Danilo?
Yeah, just briefly, it's tough, right? There's so many different, and we've been doing this forever, right? I'm an immigration policy person, doing it for many years. There's always confusion around statuses, and especially in this moment, when you've got so many bans in place, it's not clear, and it's certainly not clear for the people who are impacted about what their status and their position is. So, just to be clear, the SIV program is still on the books. All it needs to have, and SIVs can, as soon as this travel ban lifts, thousands of SIVs can continue to arrive. I just want to be clear about that. Again, this is not like Congress has terminated the refugee program. What happened very specifically is when the SIV program needs to be reauthorized every year, such that in order to apply for a new SIV, someone who's filing a new application, not someone who's already applied, but someone who's filing a new application, needs to have Congress reauthorize it, which tends to be a rote thing. It happens every year in sort of annual appropriations bills, because there's support for this program, and there's a lot of people who still need it. What happened is, in this most recent appropriations bill, Congress failed to include that reauthorization. So it can easily be reauthorized at any point, and that's only for people who are filing a new application. So anybody who's already in the pipeline, which are thousands and thousands, they're not impacted by that congressional failure. And there's going to be a lot of appropriations opportunities. I could talk about appropriations all day. There's a lot of appropriations opportunities to reauthorize the program. I think it will happen, and I will be fighting for it. And the reality is, what's holding back folks from accessing the SIV program right now, principally, is this expanded travel ban. And that could be lifted tomorrow if the administration wants it to be. So I just want to be clear about that, because I do think that article is a little bit confusing. And again, it's tough. There's so many different statuses and processes. Not every reporter is going to be, super deep in the weeds, but people are watching, of course, and I don't want that to cause unnecessary confusion.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing is Afghans have mobilized. I mean, they're very fearful about what's happening, and every time that something happens in the US RAP or in the SIV program, I'm sure you get the same thing, Danilo. I get inundated with emails from those applicants saying, please raise my voice. And it's usually like there's a form letter inside, right? And they sign their names, which for me as a journalist, I'm always saying this online, like, please don't send me form letters because I can't do anything. Send me your story. That's how I can help you. Like I'm not talking with Congress like you and your team are. So, but I get them, and I know that they're all watching and they're all waiting for any sign of hope, And so I think that it is so difficult, like from day one that I've been covering and trying to understand. I remember in the early days, writing that US RAP was a visa pipeline. And, from then on, every time state would answer a question, even though I wasn't calling it that anymore, they're like, it's not a visa pipeline. I'm like, I make one mistake and everybody would keep doing it. But then the problem is that nobody was reporting on it anymore.
Right.
Because it was too complicated to try to understand everything that was going on. And so I'm just sitting there watching all these things and trying to, but the number of people willing to go out and talk about these complicated things was smaller. And so I'm glad that you said that. The report, this is incredibly complicated. The whole interplay, as we said in the beginning, if we talked about people outside the US, this would be a 7-hour conversation of what has happened in the last year. So it is so difficult to track. It is so, and actually I didn't realize the authorization angle. I was having an issue with the fact that they kind of made it sound like because no additional visas were authorized, the program was ending. And that was what I had an issue with, where like, no, there are still visas. Now, granted, when those visas are all given out, and we don't know how many there are because there are no more quarterly updates, that's when, yes, if there are no additional,
Right. And there are thousands, to be clear, there are thousands of visas left. Yeah. So, and that's principal visas. So each principal visa could be for, so this is why we were optimistic, towards the latter part of last year, because we knew there were, regardless of what Congress did and regardless of what Congress has done, there were thousands of SIV visas left that can be used by this administration. So take Congress out of it. We can be welcoming people through the SIV program right now. And I think that's where that article wasn't clear. We do want them to reauthorize the program so new applications can come rolling in. Sure. But the most important thing right now is not I guess it's, when you think about the pipeline, right? New applications can't come into the pipeline, but the real problem is we've got thousands of visas and none of them are being used. And so, that's a much more urgent scenario. And we need that to restart immediately, and we'll work on Congress.
Yeah. And then, if we really want to follow the rabbit hole, though, with these new F&G visa denials that are like, you're denied for good, you would have to reapply. And so if it isn't reauthorized, like those people are out of luck because of the sheer timing inanities of this, and that's where it comes into. And what I guarantee you right now, somebody at IRAP is sitting there thinking, how do we sue the pants off them for this? Because every single time that something like this happens, IRAP's there. How do we?
And I encourage the audience to, there's another case. There's always other cases. So the two cases that we're following right now, two IRAP cases, of course, are UHA v. Bondi, which is this case about targeting refugees in Minnesota that, potentially is continuing. There's going to be more hearings. It might cover the targeting of refugees in other places as well. And then Afghan and Iraqi allies v. Rubio. This is the case that is requiring the Trump administration to abide by a plan to adjudicate special immigrant visa applications in a timely manner. And, as I understand, the judge ruled that the administration must resume the processing of chief of admission applications. And this was from a ruling, I think, on Friday, and there's a press release
Good.
today. So
Oh,
I think that's one to follow. If
how
you're
did
getting
I
confused by
miss
the New York
that?
Times case, this is
Oh,
one to track.
I'm gonna have to add that. I'm actually working on a piece. I'm gonna remove this from whatever, but I'm working on a
Sure.
big piece for Reason on the SIV program because they saw the New York Times article and they're like, "Can you do something for us?" I'm like, "Yeah, but that's nonsense. That is killer." Because okay, now this goes back on the record. So, IRAP has been so assiduous about making sure that, it's a 9-month timeline for SIV. That's
Yep.
what it's supposed to be, in
Yep.
recognition of the danger that people were under before the Taliban took control back of Afghanistan. Now, granted, there's a huge influx of SIVs that come in as soon as the country falls because people who never wanted to leave their homeland now realize that's the only way I have to stay alive. So it's hard, but that is a brilliant idea. If you're not giving COM approvals, then you're never going to meet the 9-month timeline, which
Right.
no one was meeting to begin with. Of course, they pushed that. I can't wait. I'm gonna go check my email and find that presser
Yeah.
immediately
It
after
was just,
this.
yeah. I've been trying to track that one as well amid everything else that's going on. So yeah, I think there's, and it's really been through litigation the last year and a half, where we've seen some signs for hope, but it's also been, again, in communities banding together and responding. And we've had some wins amid some really challenging times, but there is still hope, and I hope people are keeping the faith. And certainly we're continuing to fight for those who have been left behind. We're continuing to fight for those who are here and at risk, and just glad to be with you to talk more about it in a public way, because I think that's really important too.
I so appreciate you being here to do it. And I mean, those were some epic closing words. But if there's anything else you want to say that I didn't ask, this is your floor.
I don't think so. I encourage folks to just stay informed, if you can, and if you're in the U.S., especially if you're someone who votes, and you're comfortable speaking out, I think it's really important to use your voice. I'm not trying to tell you what to say; I'm just trying to tell you to say it. And so I definitely encourage folks to reach out to their elected leaders, to reach out to local press, to share their stories. Like I said, I think at the very beginning of this conversation, when somebody knows a refugee, when someone understands some of these complicated programs, they're much more likely to be supportive of them. And a big part of the challenge we face is misinformation, lack of information. The complexity of these processes make it really easy to simplify them into one narrative that may or may not be accurate. And so when we talk about these complex policies, that's helpful. But when we tell stories, that's the complexities come to life. And I think that's really important. So hopefully we can continue to do that, and we'll start to see some changes.
I hope so too. I appreciate you being here so much. Thank you, Danilo. And thank you to everybody who listened. Tashakor, hope to see all of you again soon.